Your lecturer is Jennifer Paxton. Dr. Paxton is the director of the University Honors Program and a clinical assistant professor of history at the Catholic University of America. She received her doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she has also taught and earned a certificate of distinction in teaching. Dr. Paxton lectures regularly at the Smithsonian Institution and serves as a study leader to Scotland and Ireland for Smithsonian Journeys. Her research focuses on England from the reign of King Alfred to the late 12th century.
Welcome to this course on the Celtic world. Let me begin right away with two paired scenes of triumph and defeat that define the sweep of Celtic history. Let's start with a pair of ancient scenes, beginning with the triumphant one. It's 390 BC. The ferocious Gaulish tribesmen of northern Italy have defeated the Roman army just outside the city of Rome. As the Gauls enter the city, they come upon the elderly Roman patricians sitting stoically unmoving on their ivory chairs outside their houses, bravely awaiting their fate. At first, the Gauls think they are statues of gods. But once they realize that they are only men, they savagely slaughter them all. The Gauls have humbled the most powerful city in Italy, the future seat of a world empire. Now the scene of Celtic defeat. It's 46 BC, shortly after Julius Caesar has brought Gaul, which is now France, under Roman control. After uniting the tribes of Gaul against Caesar, the great Gaulish rebel leader Vercingetorix has made a last, unsuccessful stand against the power of Rome. After 5 years of captivity, at the moment of Caesar's choosing, Vercingetorix is led off to Rome to be exhibited in a triumphal parade and then ritually strangled. The Gaulish threat to Rome is ended once and for all. Now let's fast forward many centuries in time and transport ourselves from the heart of the continent of Europe to its very periphery, the island of Ireland. This time we will start with a scene of Celtic defeat. It is April 1603. Hugh O'Neill is the leader of the most dangerous rebellion against English rule in Ireland since the arrival of the first English colonists in the 12th century. But after losing a key battle in the south of Ireland, he has been hiding out on his northern estates. He knows Queen Elizabeth I is close to death, but he would prefer to wait and make peace with her successor, the future James I, who he thinks will give him a better deal. Finally, O'Neill cannot hold out any longer, and he submits. Only afterwards does he discover that he has been tricked by the English Lord Deputy Mountjoy, who has concealed news of the Queen's death until after O'Neill has made his submission. The English government slowly undermines his traditional rights as an Irish chieftain until 4 years later, he feels driven to go into exile alongside several other Irish lords. This so-called Flight of the Earls marks the effective end of native rule in Ireland and the beginning of a long period of repression and marginalization for the native Irish, during which time the Irish language declines, along with many other aspects of traditional Irish culture. Now the scene of triumph. It is May 2011. A different Queen Elizabeth is on a state visit to the Republic of Ireland. She visits the graves of Irish patriots who had rebelled against British rule and leaves a floral tribute. She makes a speech in which she alludes to the troubled past relationship between Britain and Ireland with regret. And, to the astonishment and delight of her audience, she begins her speech with a couple of words in the Irish language. So, we have two encounters between Celtic peoples and their much more powerful adversaries. The first began in triumph and ended in defeat, while the second began in defeat and ended in reconciliation. Though, of course, the story continues. These encounters will form a large part of this course on the Celtic world. We will learn about the fascinating story of the ancient Celts who roamed across Europe and terrified the Romans and the Greeks, but who also created one of the most captivating art styles the world has ever seen. We will also tell the story of the Celtic Fringe, a region on the extreme edge of Western Europe, where the people created and preserved traditions in art, music, and literature that influence modern culture around the world. These Celtic areas have been defined in various ways over time, but to give them their most expansive definition, they include the whole of the island of Ireland and the western parts of Britain, especially Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall in the southwest, and also including the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Britain. But the Celtic realms also include Brittany in western France, and by some definitions, they include the northwestern parts of Spain, especially Galicia. So we've got two stories to tell, the story that takes place in the heart of Europe and the story that takes place on the periphery of Europe. And we're going to explore the connection between these two phenomena. The fierce warriors of the continent who gave the Romans a run for their money, and the residents of Ireland and the other Celtic realms who kept ancient traditions alive in the face of relentless pressure from centralizing monarchies, especially England and France. How are these two stories related? The answer used to be simple, but it has become more complicated, as we will see in a moment. This course will also tell the story of how those traditions were spread around the world by emigrants from the Celtic realms. Some of these phenomena are readily recognizable as Celtic in origin. The shamrock, the Celtic cross, the mischievous leprechaun and his pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the banshee who wails mysteriously to signal a death, the Highland bagpipe and the tartan, among many others. As we will see in later lectures, some of these supposedly Celtic traditions have been transformed in ways that their originators would not recognize. Still, most people can easily identify them as Irish or Scottish. We will tell the story of all of these phenomena in this course. But some elements of Celtic tradition and vocabulary have been incorporated into modern Western cultures so thoroughly that many people are not even aware of the Celtic origins of certain words and customs. For instance, many words have come into English from the Irish language, which is sometimes referred to outside of Ireland as Gaelic. Here are just a few that most people don't even recognize as having an Irish origin. When you call someone a phony, you are using an Irish word. When you smash something into smithereens, you are also using an Irish word. When you carve a jack-o'-lantern on Halloween and put a candle in it, you are also following an ancient Irish custom, though the Irish originally used turnips, not pumpkins. So the Celtic phenomenon is woven into our lives, and it's a fascinating story. In order to tell it, this course is going to cover nearly 3,000 years of history, and it will range from almost every part of Europe to Britain and Ireland to the New World and beyond, because the Celts have become a worldwide phenomenon. The art and music and literature of the Celts have never been more popular. For many people, Celtic culture really means Irish culture. Irish culture has, of course, been spread around the globe by the Irish diaspora, the many millions of people who trace their descent to the island of Ireland. But many of the people who find themselves fascinated by Irish culture cannot, in fact, claim any actual Irish heritage. They just like Irish music and dancing. Think of the enormous success of the Irish dancing show Riverdance, or the popularity of singers such as Enya, who draw on traditional Irish dance steps and musical traditions, respectively. Irish writers have also made a huge impact on the world. No fewer than 4 Irish authors have won Nobel Prizes for literature, a remarkable achievement considering that the entire population of Ireland is only about 7 million, less than 1% of the population of Europe. Celtic art styles have also become popular around the world. The dense, abstract patterns familiar from the medieval Irish manuscript, the Book of Kells, can now be found on everything from tea towels to t-shirts to tattoos. The reach of Irish culture, of course, extends beyond the realm of the fine arts. There are Irish pubs in every corner of the globe, from Hong Kong to Buenos Aires, and St. Patrick's Day parades can be found almost everywhere. Millions and millions of people take pleasure in wearing green and declaring themselves Irish for a day. But there is a major paradox at the heart of the Celtic craze. The Celtic realms themselves are tiny. The island of Ireland itself, which contains two political entities, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, has a population of less than 7 million. In total, the areas that identify themselves now as part of the Celtic world, what some people call the Celtic fringe, have a combined population of only around 20 million people. So how did the Celtic phenomenon spread so far and wide? Why are so many people fascinated with the Celts? That is one of the main questions we will try to answer in this course. Let me start by asking what seems like a simple question. Who are these Celts who have had such a huge impact on modern culture around the world? The answer to this question used to be very straightforward. I'm going to lay out what we thought we knew about the Celts when I first started studying them in the 1980s. It's the story of an aggressive and warlike people who gave one of the most powerful empires in European history a run for its money. According to the story I learned, the Celts are a people who arose in Central Europe in the middle of the first millennium BC. There, they created a culture that produced a particular art style that focused on beautiful abstract patterns and stylized animals. But besides being artists, they were also dedicated warriors, determined to win glory in battle. The Celts spread out from their Central European homelands throughout Europe. When they campaigned to the south and the east, they clashed with the Romans and the Greeks, who wrote the first descriptions we have of them, some of which are truly blood-curdling. In addition to sacking the city of Rome in 390 BC, the Celts desecrated the shrine of Delphi in Greece, the home of the famous oracle, in 279 BC, and afterwards established themselves in central Anatolia, which is now Turkey, becoming the ancestors of the Galatians that we know of from the New Testament. But the Celts also spread west into Gaul and down into Spain. Then, around 200 BC or so, they took to the seas and invaded Britain and Ireland, where they conquered the native inhabitants and established their own culture and language. At one point, then, the Celts dominated most of the continent of Europe, even extending down into northern Italy, where the Romans were hard-pressed to restrain their advances. A map of Europe would show a uniform Celtic hegemony from Ireland to Greece, from Spain to Austria. But then the tide turned against the Celts. Slowly, the Romans pushed the Celts back. The Romans conquered Spain first, and then Gaul, and finally Britain, though they never managed to subdue the entire island, and they left the wild north of Britain, which is now Scotland, unconquered. And they never even tried to conquer Ireland. But when the Romans were forced to withdraw from Britain, the Celts took up arms again and bravely fought a series of unsuccessful battles against a new group of invaders, the Anglo-Saxons. The Celts were then driven into the more remote corners of the island of Britain, the beautiful mountainous north and west and southwest, and some of them migrated to western France, to the region now known as Brittany, and even to northern Spain, where some remnants of Celtic populations also survived. These regions on the periphery of Western Europe, along with the entire island of Ireland, became known much later as the Celtic fringe. Thus, the story goes, only in these remote parts of Britain and in Ireland, plus Brittany and northern Spain, did the original Celtic civilization that had once covered most of Europe manage to survive. Over the centuries, the Celts clung to their cultural autonomy by cultivating their distinctive traditions in music and literature and art. All the while, they progressively came to be dominated by the strong nation-states that arose in England, France, and Spain. The Celtic area suffered from persecution of various kinds as these nation-states tried to impose their own culture, especially their language, on the stubborn Celtic population. These cultural traditions survived underground until they were revived in the 19th century as part of the great wave of nationalism that swept Europe, leading to the successful struggle for Irish independence and the revival of Celtic pride throughout the Celtic world. This version of the history of the Celts, as a people that once ruled Europe, has been enormously influential in the modern world. It is very much the story that I was taught when I first learned about the Celts, but recent scholarship has uncovered evidence that the story is much more complicated and more interesting than we used to think. For one thing, it is becoming clearer and clearer that the definition of Celtic is much harder to pin down than scholars have traditionally believed. The Celts have usually been identified by several key traits, primarily their language, their art, and their social and military customs, as we read about them in the works written about the Celts by Greek and Roman authors. The idea has been that the Celts came with a kind of Celtic cultural package. All Celts spoke Celtic languages, produced Celtic art, and did stereotypically Celtic things, like, for instance, collecting and revering severed human heads. We will talk about that a lot in a later lecture. The idea was that a Celt was a Celt, wherever you might encounter him or her in the far-flung Celtic world. As I said before, today we associate the Celts primarily with Ireland and the British Isles, because that is where the Celtic languages survived the longest. And one of the most important aspects of this Celtic hypothesis is the notion that the residents of the British Isles and Ireland can be identified with the residents of the European continent who battled against the Romans and Greeks. If the Irish and the Welsh are really just the cousins of the Gauls who confronted Julius Caesar, then we are looking at one unified story, of which the Irish and British chapter is just one part. If the Celtic hypothesis is true, then the Irish and the Welsh and the other residents of the Celtic fringe regions can consider themselves part of a story that dates all the way back to the origins of the Celts in Central Europe. The Celts who sacked Rome would be their ancestors. The trouble is, modern scholarship is causing the Celtic hypothesis to unravel. It turns out that the peoples of Ireland and Britain may have had no ethnic connection to the peoples on the continent of Europe. Scholars no longer believe that there was one unified Celtic culture spread by a specific group of people who shared a common genetic descent. Instead, it looks as though the traits we associate with the Celts today, such as their language and their art, may have spread around Europe to various peoples who had no genetic connection to each other. And these characteristics may not have started out in the same place. The art we think of as Celtic may have developed in one part of Europe, while the language we think of as Celtic may have developed in another part of Europe. It is no longer necessarily the case that we can pin one specific set of cultural features to one specific group of people. This new scholarly approach to the Celts flies in the face of centuries of settled beliefs about where the Celts came from and how they spread. Now, something is definitely lost if we abandon the old model. The earlier idea has Celts on the move, conquering Europe, and then surviving against all odds in Ireland and the fringes of Britain. This makes the Celts look extremely powerful, and it gives them a kind of romantic status as the last remnants of a lost civilization. But the problem with the model is that it's probably not true. It turns out that there is very little evidence to support the idea that there ever was a Celtic civilization. If you asked people from different parts of the so-called Celtic world in, say, 200 BC, whether they were Celts, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. People in Ireland would have had no notion of being part of a unified civilization that extended all the way to the Galatians in Turkey. Now, I know it is somewhat surprising at the start of a course about the Celts to attack the very idea that you can identify the Celts as a unified people. But rest assured, the Celtic phenomenon is even more interesting than the old model would suggest. And we are left with 3 really fascinating questions that we will try to answer in this course. The first question is, what happened among the disparate peoples who have been identified as Celtic to make them adopt the cultural traits that we associate now with Celticness? In other words, how do cultural identities form in the first place? The second question is, if the Celts were not a unified people, how did this idea of the Celts as a single people arise in the first place? We're going to spend some time in this course telling the story of how the Celts were, in a sense, invented by scholars beginning in the 16th century. At that time, scholars decided that the Celts they were familiar with from Caesar's wars against the Gauls must have been related to the people they were familiar with now in contemporary Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, and the connection stuck. So we're going to learn about how an idea was born, and then how it started to come under stress based on new scholarly work in the late 20th century and beyond. The third question, though, is going to be just as interesting to us, and that is why the culture that came to be associated with the Celts has been so successful around the world. What is it about the music and art and literature of the Celtic realms that has captured the imagination of so many people, even those who have no claim to Celtic ancestry? Is there something that we can identify as a Celtic approach to art, even to life, that speaks to people today? So if we're no longer sure that there is a strong connection between the Celts of the European continent and the inhabitants of the British Isles and Ireland, does that mean that we are going to define the Celts narrowly in this course? By no means. This course will use the most expansive possible definition of the Celtic world. We will tell 2 interlocking stories. The first story is the story of what actually happened in the areas we now think of as Celtic in some fashion, as we currently understand it. The second story, which is equally fascinating, is the story of how the legend of the Celts developed over time and influenced the politics and society of the Celtic realms in particular, but also of the whole world. To tell these 2 stories, we will need to discuss several kinds of evidence. Scholars like to talk in terms of evidence, which is simply the material they use to create a picture of what happened in the past. The Celtic story draws on many different academic disciplines or approaches to knowledge. And in many ways, the story of the Celts also allows us to tell a fascinating story of how these disciplines developed. I just want to say a few words as we get started about these different disciplines and where they enter the story of the Celts. We'll have much more to say about all of them in future lectures. So let me say something about these various approaches to knowledge that are going to help us understand the Celtic phenomenon. And I'm going to discuss them roughly in the order in which they developed as distinct methods for approaching the study of the past. Each of them has its own strengths, but also important limitations that we need to be aware of so that we can interpret the evidence in the best possible way. I'm going to start with history, which is my own discipline. The most important method used by historians is the analysis of written texts. We actually have lots of texts written about the ancient Celts, as we'll see in a future lecture, and we can learn a lot about them from the works written by the ancient Romans and Greeks who encountered them. Starting from about the 6th century, the residents of the Celtic fringe themselves wrote an enormous amount of material that we can read and analyze, though some of it is very obscure and difficult to understand. But we have lots and lots of written evidence that we can use to learn about the Celts, using traditional methods of textual analysis. Of course, these methods of analysis are very old. Historians have been analyzing written texts for over 2,000 years. But we'll see that the ways in which we analyze texts can change over time. History is a discipline that is always renewing itself. Of course, textual analysis has many drawbacks as well as advantages. We are limited by what remains. There are many things we'd like to know about the past, but if nobody chose to write them down, or if texts that recorded this information were lost, we are out of luck. We are also at the mercy of the biases of those who wrote the texts that do survive. These authors were not necessarily trying to enlighten us on the points about which we have questions. In some cases, we can tell that authors are distorting the past for their own purposes. In other cases, we probably don't even realize this. We're being fooled. But we must proceed bravely anyway. Another discipline that is absolutely essential to understanding the Celts is historical linguistics. This is the study of how languages are related to each other and how they change over time. Languages can be related to each other almost the way members of a family are related to each other, or like branches of a tree. Historical linguists try to determine how closely related to each other different languages are, and this can allow them to make certain hypotheses about the people who spoke them. People who speak closely related languages may have started out living close together, and sometimes the specific words in those languages can tell us something about where the people might have lived in the past. For example, if a language has a lot of words for snow, the people who spoke it probably came originally from an area with cold winters. Historical linguistics is crucial to our story for many reasons. One of the most important is because it is through linguistics that the connection among all of the Celtic peoples was first made, and particularly the connection between the residents of Ireland and Britain and the Celts of the continent, starting in the 16th century. It turned out that the languages spoken in Ireland and Britain were related to the language spoken in Gaul in the time of Julius Caesar. We will have much more to say about this connection later. So it was really historical linguistics that helped create the idea of the Celts as a unified phenomenon in the first place. Since the 1990s, historical linguists have been doing pioneering work in trying to determine whether newly found stone inscriptions from Spain and northern Italy were written in Celtic languages or not. So the work of linguists is crucial to the question of determining who is and is not a Celt, a question to which we will return many times in this course. Linguistics can also tell us some very important things about historical developments. For example, if we understand how the Celtic languages changed over time, we can often tell when a particular important event took place because of how that event is recorded in the Celtic languages. An important example is the Christianization of Ireland. We know that Ireland started to be Christianized in the 4th century because we know that certain words about Christianity that were borrowed from Latin into Old Irish would look one way if they were borrowed in the 4th century and another way if they were borrowed in the 6th century, due to the way the language had changed in the meantime. The study of the Celtic languages will play a very important role in this story. Finally, of course, historical linguistics is vital because we need a thorough understanding of the Celtic languages themselves if we are to understand the texts that were written by the people we're trying to study. Here is where the techniques of textual analysis and linguistic analysis intersect. Historians and linguists have to work hand in hand, particularly when studying the Celts. As I said, historical linguistics has been part of the effort to understand the Celts since the 16th century, and as the discipline of linguistics as a whole has advanced, new insights about the Celtic languages are continually coming to light. So like history, linguistics is a relatively old discipline that is still producing new information. Of course, linguistics, like textual analysis, has its own drawbacks. Languages are very complex, and if you're trying to see relationships between languages, it can be easy to focus on the features that look similar and ignore the differences, or vice versa. So caution is required. Another important academic discipline that's vital to the study of the Celts is archaeology, which really developed as an academic discipline starting in the 19th century. If historians concentrate on texts, and linguists concentrate on the languages in which those texts were written, archaeologists work without any texts at all, although of course they're happy to draw on texts when they prove helpful. Their work is focused almost entirely on physical artifacts. Academic archaeology grew out of the sort of treasure hunting that we might associate with Indiana Jones, but it quickly settled into the disciplined pursuit of knowledge about cultures from the past, as these cultures reveal themselves in the objects they created and the structures they built. Archaeologists created the idea of the discrete culture that could be identified by groups of artifacts occurring together. If you find certain kinds of pots, certain kinds of weapons, and certain kinds of personal objects like jewelry together in a region, you're probably looking at people who considered themselves to belong to the same ethnic group. That's the theory that archaeologists developed, and it proved very influential in the creation of the idea of the Celts. Archaeology is very important, particularly to the study of the ancient Celts, because very, very little written material has survived from the Celts themselves. But the drawback of archaeology is precisely the fact that the artifacts cannot talk. We can't be sure from looking at pots or brooches what languages their owners spoke, or what ethnic groups they considered themselves to be members of. And we're also limited by what has happened to survive and what archaeologists have happened to find. But we're also going to talk about a brand new kind of evidence, DNA evidence. Scientists can now do two kinds of DNA analysis that can help us understand the ancient Celts. They can analyze the DNA of bones preserved in ancient burials, and they can also analyze the DNA of living persons to help them understand something about where different populations came from and how they are related to each other. Is there something distinctive genetically about the Celtic regions? How does DNA shed light on some of the big questions about Celtic identity? So we'll be covering a lot of ground in this course, from ancient texts to the latest scientific advances, and all of it will help us to understand the world of the Celts. We'll start in our next lecture by looking in detail at what happened when the Greeks and the Romans met the Celts for the first time.